let me throw this in there because when we talk about the mafia and Rico, the mafia is that popularized this whole Rico
That's
law.
who the target was.
Right, that's who the target was. But these people, so when you talk about whether it's the feds or your local police, they have an ongoing investigation to where they accumulated evidence, whether it's videos or recordings, yada yada yada. It was ongoing. So if they want to say, oh, you had a drug cartel going on, distributing drugs, selling drugs for profit, or you had a whorehouse and that's how you was making your profit, they have proof of these people in the act of doing it. To whereas Diddy, these are just people coming on a stand saying he paid for prostitutes for me to have sex.
Well,
It's
yeah, and see, there's another fundamental difference here. It being a successful crook is time consuming. I've had clients that were. So if you spend 55 hours a week and you're running numbers games, you're running drugs, you're running prostitution, you're running porn on the QT, you're running a thing where you've got bootleg movies that you're selling, where you're doing a few hits on the side or enforcement where for minor stuff somebody hasn't paid back the loan sharking, you go and break a kneecap and something like that. That's you spend your time predominantly involved in criminal activity is your primary job or source of income. The problem with Diddy here, though it's marginal from the accusations, is that he was making big, big, big income in what is generally legitimate business, entertainment. All right. And what it looks like is his illicit behavior, such as it may be defined, was simply for the purpose of ensuring that nobody was able to blackmail him like is the tendency of the entertainment industry because he had the goods on them or he was doing somebody a particular favor, but that's not how he generated his primary income. In other words, it's like you got a job, you paid $146,000 a year, and you want to bet with somebody on a Super Bowl game of $100. Obviously, that's not how you earn your income.
no.
Technically, it's illegal because in most states, gambling, even the kind we do at a Super Bowl game, is technically illegal. Nobody gets arrested because there are no cops there to witness this and eyeball it and say, I saw them breaking the law. Even in Vegas, unless you're in a casino and in a formal license situation, gambling's illegal. So, I mean, just think about it. How many
Mhm.
times do we have a bet on the outcome of a bowl game, a playoff game, where we do it with impunity, talk about it because there are no cops there to witness us doing it, but it's illegal under the laws of that particular state. All
So
right.
here's so here's what I want to just one last thing I just want to show here. This is the judge final verdict sheet. So, and I guess this is how the jurors supposed to um come up with their um what do you call it, whether it's guilty or not. So it says acts involving kidnapping, not prove, acts involving arson, not prove, acts involving bribery, not prove, acts involving witness tampering, not prove, acts involving forced labor, acts involving sex trafficking, acts involving transportation for purpose of prostitution, acts involving drug distribution. So if you were a juror, or if, let me use me.
Let me say this. That's new. That's
Which
a new
one?
development. This whole thing is a new development in law. I've tried some of these cases involving the Mann Act in federal court before.
What's new? This sheet?
Yeah, this shit, that's new. See, they
Oh,
didn't have that. You
but
were,
doesn't this make it easier?
it might, but the problem is you want somebody to be analytical, rational, reasonable, and go down a checklist one step and stage at a time.
But
Most
this is
Americans are not trained to do that these days. And when they voir dire them, that is, decide whether they can be fair, neutral, impartial, and detached and objective in a trial, you never get into this. See,
mm,
that's logic, and they don't teach that in school anymore. So where is this person supposed to learn it?
mhm,
So that's where the problem comes in. You're asking them to play a careful role as an analyst rather than coming up with a gestalt. For most of American history, what a jury verdict was a gestalt. In other words, an overall impression. And the crucial issue was, when you look back on everything you heard, are you sure, absolutely sure, that there is no other reasonable thing that could have happened based on the evidence that you heard, but what the prosecution contends happened? In other words, even if you believe the person is guilty, but you can logically say there is another possibility, you're supposed to vote for acquittal. When you come up with a case like this, one of the big inherent problems is, what the devil are you proving here? Are you proving something is an absolute certainty beyond a reasonable doubt? Or are you just saying, I want you to believe that this is a bad guy? And somewhere in there is a drop off. Now, I say this in context: for 30 years, the Tennessee pattern instruction on what reasonable doubt is, I wrote it. They've changed it in the last few years, but for 30 some years, I wrote the charge. I didn't like the original one, so I rewrote it. The defense took me up on it, but the state Supreme Court adopted my instruction as the pattern jury charge. By the way, that's common law and that's judge made law, because the legislative body is not sufficiently able or knowledgeable to draft such things. And there is a problem that every case is not identical, and there are things that are new under the sun. So, what do you do when you're confronted with them? There is a set of pattern jury instructions, they call them, that judges are directed to, from which they bring up and they draft and craft what they're going to charge the jury. Sometimes it's easy enough because it fits a given set of common circumstances. Sometimes it doesn't, so the judge has to make modifications. And if he makes the wrong modifications, then there's no valid conviction, because there is a version of this everywhere, including in federal court. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you are judges of both the facts and the law, but you are acting under the direction of the court. The court is the source from which you get the law that you act as a judge of. You are to bring your own observations and experiences in life to bear on your assessment of the credibility of the witnesses, the probability or improbability of their contentions and representations. You are to look at the demeanor, the bearing, eye contact, the tone of voice, how someone sits on the witness stand, in determining whether or not you lend credibility to the witness. Is the proposition presented to you logical, reasonable, rational, possible, or does it require some leap of faith into some sort of speculation that common sense reveals is not appropriate? In other words, this would be explainable if dogs could fly and it flew up on this platform on top of this 100-foot tall flagpole. Okay,
mhm.
but dogs can't fly, so that's not a reasonable explanation. But if it's one that is reasonable, then you have to say, well, if I bring in all of these uh, assessments of reasonable possibilities, if I can come up with anything that doesn't support the conclusion of guilt, I'm supposed to acquit the person, even if I believe he's guilty. It's
Right.
just a logical, reasonable, rational thing. But over the last 50 years, we taught our population to be emotional, subject to whim, subject to desire, rather than being cold blooded, analytically precise, and objective.
I want to just play a game real quick. I want to pretend I'm the juror, and what would, this is how I would pick, right? So kidnapping, arson, bribery, witness tampering, forced labor, I will put all not proved. Acts involving sex trafficking, I will put not proved. Acts involving transportation for purpose of prostitution, I will put proof because he paid for prostitutes. And then acts involving
Yeah,
drug,
but there's one difference here.
what?
The prostitutes are not alleged to be victims. You see, the other thing is
Will
they,
you say that again? Say that again.
in other words, the people who engaged in the alleged prostitution are not alleged to be victims. They aren't charged with any offense. You see what I'm saying here? In other words, what are you talking about? In other words, you get a pimp and you charge the pimp with procuring prostitution because he's got prostitutes working for him. But are you bringing in the prostitutes and charging them with complicity in the acts? In other words, if you've got nobody that you have accused of being the prostitute or liable to any criminal offense, what are you talking about?
Oh, I see. So it can't just be one person.
Yeah, in other words, see, all of these.
So the purpose, the transportation, it says so acts involving transportation of purpose of prostitution, it would have to be him and the prostitute being charged.
Yeah, let me give you an actual case. You'll get the point. There are two school teachers. They went to high school together and they went for 2 years to a college together and they had an affair. All right. Both of them wound up graduating from college. They taught school. Each had been married but divorced. There was a teachers' conference across the river in West Memphis, Arkansas. Okay. The male teacher was at this conference. He ran into the female teacher. They decided, since they were bored, to try and get it on. Well, the feds were interested in the older brother of the school teacher, who they alleged was dealing with narcotics trafficking. So they followed the male teacher over there. So one of the teachers left their car in the parking lot and drove back together over to Memphis, and they checked into a hotel. So when they got into the hotel, the federal agents were listening, and when it sounded like they had sex, they busted them in and they charged the both of them, or the guy rather, with the Mann Act, the same one that they've got Diddy charged with, same offense. And what they were trying to do is lean on him and get him to rat out his older brother. So,
Well,
in other words, I wound up having to defend him on a Mann Act charge in federal court.
yeah, you're confusing me, but the thing
In
is,
other words, it's two school teachers. So, what happens is one school teacher goes across state lines from Arkansas to Tennessee, just across the bridge, Mississippi Bridge, and for illicit purposes to have a sexual rendezvous in a hotel. So, he gets charged with Mann Act violations, transporting a female across state lines for an illicit purpose. Well, it shouldn't have gone to trial, but it did, and I got my client
right, but
acquitted.
I need okay now compare it to this because this
Well,
I'm
in
focused.
other words, it doesn't have to be a good,
I'm talking
solid
about the
case.
prostitution. He paid for a
Yeah,
prostitute to
in
come in
other
there.
words, what are you calling prostitution? As a matter of fact, during the trial, the federal prosecutor accused the woman of being transported for prostitution because the guy paid for the hotel room. And on the way over there, the school teacher male stopped at a department store with the female. They went shopping and he bought her a purse. So the feds were claiming that that was soliciting prostitution because he exchanged something of value for sex. So that's what they were using to go base their little
Right,
man
so
act
these
thing.
were professional escorts, so he paid for them in
Yeah.
cash.
So where did you get them coming in and how did they
So
get caught up?
to this purpose here on this form,
Yeah.
acts involving transportation for purpose of prostitution because he flew them in. I will have to say proved.
Yeah, but what if you fly your girlfriend in and you buy
But
her
it's
a
not
new
that.
suit?
But it's not the girlfriends. It's the professional escort
I got it. But
prostitutions. that he flew in to have sex.
Well, yeah, I got that part, but
So I would say that was proved in
but
this case.
here's the thing I'm saying. When the transaction went down, it was just interest, sexual interest. But later on, 8 years later, 7 years later, 4 years later, somebody said, we're going to prosecute you if you don't agree with us. Wait a minute, man, this was just me getting my freak on. Well, you're going to say it was prostitution.
He paid him.
Yeah, but what happens when you take the woman that you put on an airplane to visit you and you take her shopping? Or you say, oh, I know you need your
No,
rent
no, no,
paid
no.
for
But
this
see, this
month,
is
so I'm
the
going to
but
pay you
judge.
your rent money.
I get that, but this is not that. In this case, it wasn't a girlfriend. It was a prostitute he put on a plane.
How
That's
many
what they do
years?
for a living.
How many years after the fact did this person say it was prostitution?
Let's just say it was. Well, he's been locked up for a year, so let's just say 2 years, right before he got locked up.
4 years ago, 3 years ago.
No, a year ago. So it was before they raided his house.
Yeah,
That
I know.
year he was doing that.
Yeah.
But I'm talking about. So going back to the beginning, I want to wrap this up. You're saying a witness getting on the stand saying he paid me to do this, blah 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 blah. I'm the defendant. I'm not getting on the stand for you to ask me that question to say yay and nay. So now everyone that took the stand that said, okay, he paid me to come in and have sex with him and his girlfriend, that is technically considered hearsay, which means going back to this act involving transportation purposes of prostitution, would you say it wasn't fully proven yet?
Amongst other things. Now try this one. There are statute of limitations that are not long on such acts as committing an act of prostitution. All right.
Can I just ask you this simple? Wait, one thing. We'll stop for 1 second. This is for my purpose. Just because somebody said you paid them for sex doesn't mean that you can actually find them guilty of soliciting prostitution.
Yeah, because the person that's making that claim is not law enforcement, and there's no law enforcement person that witnessed it, and there was no warrant outstanding for the person when the arrest was effectuated. The other thing is the statute of limitations is run. In other words, this person paid me for prostitution, but it's been so long ago, you can't prosecute
No, but
me.
you can't use that. The statute wasn't run out because it wasn't that it was recent. But to the first part, let's stick to the first part that it wasn't a police officer. So why didn't the defense argue that?
I don't know. Maybe they weren't, shall we say, ingenious enough. But here's the other thing too. If a prostitute sells her body to some customer on the street, vice buster, is that a felony or a misdemeanor?
Well, misdemeanor, right?
Yeah. So in other words, the statute of limitations on the misdemeanor is how long?
How long?
1 year. So what happens is 5 years after the fact, you want to prosecute somebody for setting this deal
No.
up, or
Okay,
you can't prosecute.
right. But in Diddy case, it wasn't over. This was throughout 10 years. The most recent, let me finish. The most recent was the same year his homes got raided.
Okay.
So
why then are you going over 10, 12, 15 years worth of
I guess right. So it didn't. So the current prostitutions he paid for did not the statute of limitations did not pass. However, the prosecutions, they were adding stuff on from 10 years ago, 5 years ago,
15.
and current.
15.
Did they go back 15? Well, they went back to the Cassie thing because it says right here. Let me read this real quick. It says, if and only if you find the defendant guilty of count 1, did the pattern of racketeering activity include sex trafficking of Cassie Ventura? ? Yes and no. And I guess kidnap. I don't know what the act 1 was, but yeah, I don't know. This is kind of weird.
I know. is. In other words, what the intent was not so much to get a conviction, but to get Diddy out of the way so he would not embarrass somebody. Now, I'll give you another example. Stormy Daniels was supposedly paid hush money by at that time, former President Donald Trump. Okay, if you pay somebody hush money, it has to be to hush up a crime. What crime was committed by Donald Trump based on Stormy Daniels' testimony? None. The law is if you pay somebody hush money to keep from being embarrassed, that's called being blackmailed. So, in other words, the whole prosecution was based on going after somebody, Donald Trump, who got blackmailed by Stormy Daniels, if you looked at the evidence that way. So, how did that come about? Well, the whole thing is on stay right now, and it's not likely to go anywhere on appeal. But that's what I'm talking about. In other words, this is the exact same group of people in the exact same part of the country, dominated by a certain political party and certain outlooks on things, that went after Diddy. Remember, the warrants were in California and Florida, but the prosecution's in New York, New York. Same place the prosecution went after the mayor of New York, New York. Same
Right.
place where Tish James went after Donald Trump for doing less than she did for certain circumstances, and the same place where they went after Donald Trump because he paid hush money allegedly to Stormy Daniels for hushing up what? A crime? No, there was not one single crime permitted.
This sheet here, basically, you're saying that all of it should just be not proved. It really wasn't
I don't know.
proved with beyond a reasonable doubt. It wasn't
Well,
proved beyond a reasonable doubt.
here's my problem with it. They may have proved it beyond a reasonable doubt, but the problem is that you are trying to get jurors who have not been required to demonstrate the particular academic expertise to act like the most logical, reasonable, and rational scientist, theoretical physicist, or chemist in doing an analysis of something and coming up with a result. That is a little crazy. That is entirely too complicated, and it is too fraught with opportunities for an injustice to occur. And what it strikes me as is somebody was pushing the limits because they had another objective besides to bring justice to the situation. They were trying to protect someone. And their objective was to get the person incommunicado, out of the way and out of the public limelight after you embarrassed him and tried to tear him to shreds, so nobody would pay attention when it came time to go to the polling place prior to or during the November 2024 election cycle.